Hi, it's Louise from Opal People Solutions. Michelle, a local business owner, is with me today to understand what she should do if she thinks an employee isn't entirely happy in the workplace.
Thank you so much, Louise. So I am here just to ask a few questions in terms of being an employer, being a business owner. What advice would you give me if I did think that somebody was unhappy in the workplace?
The first thing that I would say to you, Michelle, is to deal with it immediately. Generally speaking, when an employer becomes aware of a situation, it's at a low level and it's easily resolved. But unfortunately, too many people think it'll just go away and it'll resolve itself. And in my experience, invariably that escalates into something much bigger and much more difficult then to resolve.
Yeah, and as business owners, we do have responsibilities for our employees. How do we fulfill those responsibilities? How are there specific guidelines that we need to follow?
In a disciplinary scenario, there's a legal requirement to have a procedure. That doesn't exist with respect to grievances. However, if the situation, as I say, escalated and somehow ended up in tribunal, they will look to see that you have, as a very minimum, followed the Labour Relations Code of Practice. So it is always advisable to have a grievance procedure that is modelled on that code of practice.
And with all these procedures and things that we do have to follow, obviously there are consequences if we don't adhere to them. Are there serious consequences of that?
There's two potential routes that I would see. The legal consequence, which is that an employee resigns because you have fundamentally breached their trust. They resign and their recourse is to claim for constructive dismissal at tribunal. So obviously you've got legal costs associated with that, and then potentially a payout. On the other side of things, even if it doesn't escalate through to tribunal stages, there is the mental impact on the individual, because if you haven't dealt with it, the situation that is causing stress to that individual hasn't been resolved, and that may lead to a situation where an employee is often sick, which obviously is a cost to you in terms of sick pay, whether that's statutory or whether it's company, and obviously you need to replace that potential individual. There's potential impact on morale as well within the organisation. If that individual is aggrieved as a result of bullying that you haven't dealt with, remember you've got a legal obligation to protect them from bullying. And although there is no recourse at tribunal for straightforward bullying, there is recourse through the High Court as a health and safety issue if there is psychological damage. On the other hand, if the individual is being bullied because of one of the prescribed characteristics, so religion, sex, disability, race, those sorts of issues, then there is recourse to that individual at tribunal.
In your experience, what sort of situations arise that kind of results in an employee becoming unhappy or, wanting to raise a grievance?
Any number of reasons, Michelle, but they fall within kind of broad categories. So it might be an issue to do with their pay. So, for example, a female thinks she's paid less than a male counterpart. It could be their treatment or their perceived treatment either by their employer or by a fellow employee. It could be in relation to their conditions that they're working in or with respect to their workload.
So, if an employer does become aware of a situation where they do think an employee isn't happy, are there steps that they should follow to really address the concerns?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would advise is if you don't already have a grievance procedure, let's get one in place, because that guides you in terms of the process that you follow. That can then be issued to the employee as well so that they understand the steps that you're going to follow. The first stage in that is this a formal grievance or is it an informal grievance? I will always advise and try to get you to deal with any issue through the informal procedure, because it's easier fixed. The more cumbersome it becomes through a formal procedure, the more difficult it can be to resolve. But that is entirely the employee's decision as to which route they want to take. So let's assume that they want to deal with it through the formal procedure. There are a number of more basic steps than you would have in a disciplinary procedure. It's a much more simplistic process to go through, but the first stage is to meet with the employee to understand exactly the nature of their grievance. some are, if it's a pay issue, for example, between that a male is paid higher than a female comparator, that's probably fairly easy for you to go off and investigate, and it's not too onerous. However, if they're making an allegation, for example, of bullying and harassment against another employee, you need to then investigate with that employee. And bear in mind, this could result in disciplinary proceedings. So you need to make sure that the two procedures of a grievance procedure and a disciplinary don't conflict with each other. So I would, as a matter of course, be offering the right of representation to that employee through that particular process. You may have witnesses that either party put forward that can corroborate what they have said. And then you have to go away and look at all of the evidence that you've gathered as part of that process and make a decision as to whether the employee's complaint should be upheld if there's merit in the complaint. You sometimes can partially uphold a complaint, and sometimes there's no evidence at all that that process or that there is a genuine grievance that you can find evidence for. In all cases, the employee should have a right to appeal against your decision if they see fit. And obviously, as said, in the bullying harassment case, you need to make sure that you have a bullying harassment procedure to deal with that. At the minute, only claims or situations whereby the allegation is that bullying is on the grounds of one of the prescribed characteristics, so religion, sex, disability, race, age, that has recourse through the industrial tribunal. However, sometimes bullying is just because somebody fundamentally doesn't like another individual. And in that case, if there are mental health issues that arise as a result of the extent of that bullying, then the employee has recourse through a health and safety route, which is through a High Court proceedings.
So as business owners, we obviously have responsibility to really make sure that employees are happy and that are working in a safe environment. And there is a lot within that, especially if we do detect somebody is unhappy. Mm-hmm. In your experience, what can Opal People Solutions offer and support if, an employer does think, actually, there is somebody that I do think is unhappy, or a situation comes to light, I suppose?
Yeah. Michelle, I'll always be guided by the individual client, and it depends how comfortable they are dealing with a situation. For the most part, employers aren't necessarily comfortable. They don't necessarily have the skills to carry out this process. So in addition to providing them with a grievance procedure or a bullying harassment procedure, we can supply all the documentation that they will need, all the communication between the employer and the employee, or any third party that's part of this investigation. We can sit in on those meetings and support and guide the decision making without actually physically making any decisions.